Welcome everyone, all 70 odd, and thank you for joining us. My name's Jackie Lothian from Clinks. Part one of the session this morning and most of the session is going to concentrate on an introduction to the probation dynamic framework and an overview. It's by no means a comprehensive walkthrough because for anybody who's looked at the market warming documents, you'll have seen that there is a lot of detail and a lot of depth, but this is simply an initial overview to highlight the key points and signpost you to more detailed information. Be followed by a Q&A, as I've said, and we have colleagues from HMPPS and MOJ and the probation review team here who will be able to answer questions. So the second part of the session will focus on the IT requirements. We know that for a lot of voluntary sector organisations, there are a lot of questions about the IT certification that will be required to qualify under the framework. So we're going to have a brief outline from one of our MOJ probation review team colleagues on that. Okay, lovely. Well, let's press on then. So since the announcement back in the summer of 2018 that CRC contracts would end and that the MOJ would consult on a new model for probation, Clinks have been working to represent and feed in the views of the sector to the probation review programme. We've held a number of different consultation events and roundtables with the sector as the programme's developed. And in May 2019, the consultation response was published and it was announced that offender management would be reunified under the National Probation Service. In the last couple of weeks, it's been announced that unpaid work and accredited programmes which were previously going to be contracted out to probation delivery partners would also be delivered by the National Probation Service. And this was on the basis that in the context of COVID-19, it would allow for more flexibility and stability. In addition, the dynamic framework for the commissioning of rehabilitation and resettlement services was launched. Throughout the development of the programme, Clinks has been pleased to see that there has been a commitment to the role of the voluntary and community sector in providing resettlement services. And we have been working closely with MOJ and HMPPS to advise on how this commitment can become a reality. And our colleague Jess Mullen, who isn't here at the moment, has worked relentlessly to ensure that the sector's views are represented and heard. We have, I would think, it's possible to say that there have been some wins through that process for the sector. We've been advocating especially for the role of small specialist organisations in the delivery of probation services and for the need to remove barriers to their participation. And on that score, we have seen a number of policy wins. The simplification of the system and the unification of offender management means that voluntary organisations will now have a direct relationship with the public sector probation services, so they won't have to go through an intermediary or another company. The fact that there is now a separate contract lot for women's services to ensure that their distinct needs can be met is a really positive development, and that is wholeheartedly welcomed by the specialist women's sector. The fact that there have been a number of market stewardship protections built in, and some of that has been based on Clinks's learning from our Track TR research, which looked at the impact of the transforming rehabilitation programme and contracting process on the sector. You know, there have been protections built in as a result of that, which we're pleased about. And then finally, the fact that where possible, contracts will be let at Police and Crime Commissioner level to allow a local response has been offered. This is now a bit more complex and we'll touch on that a bit later, but certainly some contracts will be let at PCC level, which is good. So there are still some outstanding issues that Clinks is looking to continue to influence around. We believe that grant funding is key to ensuring that small and specialist organisations can play their full role. And there really needs to be an emphasis on grants over contracts. We also want to see specialist services for people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, and we want to see those services commissioned from day one. We believe this is needed for the model to be fully implemented in the spirit of the LAMI review recommendations. We continue to work with the probation review team to highlight barriers to the participation of small specialist organisations and to push for the creation of a level playing field for the voluntary sector. We know there are concerns around IT requirements, and we can touch on that later on. Clinks is also, through the Reducing Reoffending Third Sector Advisory Group, making recommendations about how the competition can be run. In the context of COVID-19 and the fact that many organisations are currently dealing with a greater demand for services and reduced resources and obviously adapted service delivery models that haven't been allowing for face-to-face work. So Clinks is continuing to talk to the probation review about all of these things, and the review team have been very open to our concerns, and they do welcome suggestions, practical suggestions for things that will help. Okay, so the dynamic framework, and what is it? Essentially, it's a system through which organisations can qualify in order to be able to bid for and apply for contracts and grants to deliver rehabilitation and resettlement services in the future. To qualify, organisations will need to demonstrate expertise in the relevant service areas and state which geographical areas they're interested in delivering services in. You can qualify at any time, but to be invited to bid or to apply for a grant or a contract, you need to qualify in the relevant services and geographies in advance of that specific competition being announced. If you haven't qualified at the time the invitation is issued, you can still do that and submit a call-off bid, as long as the deadline for that call-off hasn't passed. So you need to be within the deadline for the call-off. HMPPS can commission through the framework, but so can other commissioners, for example, police and crime commissioners, either alone or jointly with HMPPS or with other local commissioners. And they'll be able to join with other commissioners using their procurement routes. And we understand that this is something that's likely to develop in Greater Manchester, perhaps ahead of other areas, and we'll say a little bit more about Greater Manchester later on. Okay, so qualification is the process by which organisations apply to be on the framework. And this is intended to be a relatively light touch process. It requires organisations to demonstrate experience and provide case studies that are relevant to the need category that they're interested in, as well as certain standard selection criteria. So essential information about the organisation, whether there may have been convictions for fraud or corruption, what we might know as due diligence process. As part of the process, you also have to accept the standard framework agreement, which contains various terms and conditions that will apply to any grants awarded under the framework. You'll also have to state the geographic area of interest, although this won't be assessed until the call-off. If organisations are unsuccessful, they will receive feedback. After an unsuccessful bid, there'll be 2 more attempts to bid for a place on the framework. If the organisation is unsuccessful after the 3rd bid, there will be a 6-month period before the organisation can bid again. So what services will be commissioned? The list there shows the category of services or the category of service user need that have been identified and for which services will be commissioned to meet those needs through the framework. So they don't describe the activities, but they focus on the needs of people likely to be under probation supervision. So there isn't a specific category of activity, for example, arts or mentoring, but those kind of activities obviously could meet some of the need areas. And in fact, the need area of social inclusion does mention mentoring. In terms of funding, there'll be more than 100 million a year available to fund the services, although it's likely that less will be spent initially to reflect the time it will take to mobilise the provision of services in all these areas. Services will be commissioned in lots, and some of them will have the need areas bundled together. Service specifications will be published for each of the need categories, and they will be outcome based with only core activities specified. Services will be expected to be flexible and responsive to service user complexity. The more criminogenic needs identified, combined with the service user's willingness or ability to address them, will determine the complexity of the service delivery required. So not all of the need areas are going to be commissioned centrally by HMPPS as services to be provided from day one as part of the new model. The areas on the list highlighted in bold are the need areas for which those services will be commissioned to begin from June 2021. So you can see there we've got accommodation, family and significant others, lifestyle associates, emotional wellbeing, social inclusion, women and young adults. In some probation areas, regional directors may choose to commission other services from day one. We don't know yet exactly when services will be commissioned, but we know that the timetable for the sequencing, the order of call-off competitions for day one contracts is due to be published very soon. Clinks and the Reducing Reoffending Third Sector Advisory Group are in close discussion with the probation review team about the minimum time that organisations will need to participate in those competition processes. In the context of COVID-19 and its impact on the sector. We've highlighted that organisations may well be able to participate in the qualification process, which is relatively light touch. But this can't be taken as a signal of market readiness for engaging in the competition processes themselves. The other areas of service need beyond day one will be commissioned in the future by regional probation directors according to local need. It's possible to commission grants through the dynamic framework, but we do have some concerns that the majority of services are still likely to be commissioned through contracts, and this is something that Clinks will continue to raise with the probation review team. So just taking a closer look at the day one services. So these are the services that will be commissioned to be available from day one of the new model in June 2021. And you can see that in some cases, those on the right, a number of need categories have been bundled together into single contract lots. Previously, it had been planned that all would be commissioned at PCC level, and that dependency and recovery and finance, benefit and debt would also be commissioned from day one. But again, in response to the impact of COVID-19, HMPPS have scaled back the scope for day one services. So as you can see, the accommodation and the education training and employment contracts will be commissioned at NPS regional level, so 12 competitions in total. And if I can just show you this slide briefly, you can see the probation regions there on the list, and as we've said, the accommodation and ET contracts will be commissioned at MPS regional level. So just going back to the previous slide, the personal wellbeing and the women's services contracts are multi-need service lots. and that they include more than one need category, and they've been bundled together in one contract. What this means for women's services clearly is that they're seeking holistic approaches, which, as we understand it, has been very positively received by the women's sector. Also, they will be commissioned at PCC level, which means that there will be 42 different competitions. We understand that there'll be a personal wellbeing lot specifically for young adults commissioned in Wales. So Greater Manchester, as previously mentioned, is going to be slightly different to the rest of the country. We understand that they're looking at a co-commissioning model, and they may not commission services through the dynamic framework, although they will still be commissioning as a minimum similar services, albeit through a different procurement route and possibly different bundles of lots. And this reflects the extent to which there's devolution in Greater Manchester, and there's been considerable work on a whole system approach around reducing reoffending. All the competitions were previously proposed to be commissioned at Police and Crime Commissioner level, and the increase in contract size for accommodation and the employment training and education services could present challenges to ensuring that small local specialist organisations are appropriately involved, and may mean that to participate there will have to be part of supply chains. We know from experience with transforming rehabilitation there have been problems with some supply chains, and we're pleased to see that there are a number of supply chain protections in place which Clinks has advocated for, and these have been published now as part of the market warming materials. In addition, the multi-service lots, especially for personal wellbeing, are likely to require organisations to form partnerships and consortia. And as Dave mentioned, we're running sessions next week to look specifically at the question of partnerships and consortia. So for now, we're just going to touch briefly on the market stewardship, which has been put in place and which we welcome. So this is a very simple overview. There's far more detail in the market warming documents, including details of the potential options that may be used for payment and performance measures and the evaluation options for bids. At the moment, obviously, we recommend everybody registering on the MOG e-sourcing portal. It used to be called Bravo, it's now called Jaeger, I think, or something like that. So you need to register for two distinct events on the portal. One just has the market warming material, and the other is the competition and framework agreement itself. Once you're registered, you can also submit questions. I think Andreas made reference to the process for submitting questions and having them published on the portal. They'll be routinely responded to and answered so that all potential bidders get access to that information. So, as I said before, we're running the partnership events next week, and if you are interested in bidding for multi-service lots or bidding in partnership at regional level, it's well worth thinking about registering for those events next week. I should have said at the beginning that we're going to circulate these slides. For those of you who've been hastily taking notes, I apologise. The next three slides I'm not actually going to talk to, but they do provide details around accessing the portal and using the system. So I'm just going to move through them. You can see what's there, but I'm not going to talk to them. So yeah, I think this is the final slide, and it's just giving the information about the partnership events. As said, you're going to get lots of information on building partnerships and covering best practice in the areas of consortia development and implementation. And also those events, because they're going to be organised geographically, they'll give you the opportunity to make connections with other organisations in your regions and help you to start thinking through and developing the relationships. We'll do this through breakout rooms on geographical basis. I'm going to bring the session to a close. Can I say a huge thank you to colleagues from MOJ, HMPPS, Eastside Primetimers and my Clinks colleagues. Thanks all for making it work, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day and you get to see some sun and you're not poring over the portal documents for the rest of the day. All right, thanks everyone. I'm going to close the meeting.